Well, thank you to everyone from all over the globe joining us for the latest in the MillerKnoll Insight series online. MillerKnoll is a family of brands, and you can see them all in front of you. And just in case you don't know, all these brands are companies that design and manufacture products for places where people live, where they get healed, where they learn, and where they work. We love to get guest speakers with a variety of subjects, but we also enjoy partnering with incredibly great people and institutes. And today's talk is as a result of a joint piece of work that MillerKnoll commissioned from the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies, which by its name tells you that it's based in Copenhagen. And our guest today is Lovisa Volmarsson. Lovisa has an architectural background. Is going to be sharing some work around some future scenarios of cities that we worked on together with a group of people. And it is not about predicting the future, but I would suggest to you this is an invite. Have a look at what we've got, have a look at the thoughts, and if you're interested in joining workshops around some of these thoughts, we would love to hear from you. But I'm really excited to hand over to Lovisa, who's going to tell us a little bit more about herself and CIFS. And over to you. Thank you very much for joining us, Lovisa.
Thank you so much for having me and the fantastic introduction. So I work at the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies, and we are an independent, non-profit think tank working with exploring, imagining, and unfolding futures. Our aim and mission is to give organizations, individuals, the necessary tools and capabilities to imagine, work with, and shape their own future. And together with MillerKnoll, we have explored possible future scenarios for urban living, resulting in these 4 co-created scenarios towards 2038. And the future of urban life is perhaps one of the most important topics presenting itself to all citizens, organizations, and decision makers today. And why urban living? I don't know if you have ever typed in future city in your preferred search engine. Well, the story that unveils itself is a dominant one. One of chrome towers, of steel, of glass, of high-speed transportation, and maybe even a little bit of a controlled nature. Or it might even be artificial. It's really hard to tell. But even though we know that search engines consist of self-reinforcing algorithms, which selects more of the same, maybe we should call into question whatever this is the kind of imaginaries we aspire to produce more of when it comes to how the cities of tomorrow might look like. Or at the very least, maybe raise the following question. Is this the only story or images of future cities and urban living that we want to continue being told? We know that the cities of tomorrow will be more complex, they will be larger, which will present a number of challenges for this 21st century. So how do we address them? By understanding what's happening in the outside world, we can make better decisions in our own worlds and workplaces. And here we, by this presentation, we would like for you to be inspired to maybe think around urban living in a new way, to provoke a discussion and debate around our common urban future and the implications that it might have on the places we live, we work, we learn, and we heal. But before we start with the scenarios, I would like to just give a short introduction into future thinking and scenarios. So the future already exists in the present, but just as a potential, there's no limits to the amount of possible futures. We always work from the pretense that there exist multiple futures, meaning that there's not only one future that's already predefined. But also that the further we venture out into the future away from the present, the greater the space of opportunity expands and it becomes larger, and sort of the different potential futures become even more diverse. And this awareness over our potential future can empower us to act with greater agency and responsibility as we recognize the potential consequences of our actions shaping the future. So future thinking can help you act in the present by understanding the larger context in which our future unfolds. And it can help us to gain insights in what aspects can be influenced and what lies beyond our own control. So scenarios are snapshots of plausible alternative futures, and they are different from traditional future projections, which typically entail more sort of a mathematical forecast or intricate science, making them difficult for the general public to envision. I like to give an example of the IPCC report, where they also use scenarios, but they are very different types of scenarios than the one we use and work with. So, for example, I mean, I can understand what 50 centimeters of sea level rise would be, what it is, but what it would look like, what it would feel like, what it would be to embody that future if that were to happen. It's really hard to visualize for me. Like it's really hard to understand the implication that that would actually have on a city like Copenhagen. So scenarios can make it easier for people to imagine what the future could look like, and therefore feel more at liberty to make decision and take action. Scenarios can therefore help us to shift perspective through a combination of analysis and storytelling. And I think it's really important to emphasize that scenarios in themselves are not projections, they are not predictions, but rather a contribution to a discussion, effort to synthesize positions and build consensus, or simply used as provocations to start a debate around what type of future would we actually like to live in. And they are also meant to help us to think about the future in new ways and sort of plan that the future can look different. There are many different multiple potentialities that we might need to consider than when we only consider the stories we have of the future that are kind of accepted, like the one I talked about, like the future city. We have one type of story. We might miss opportunities or challenges that is really important for us to acknowledge already today. So we are all literate in stories, which is a fantastic sort of shared language that we have. Pretty much all cultures around the world have the elements of storytelling, accessible in a way that forecast and science are not. And they can help us to communicate and dismantle ideas with one another. Narratives of imagined futures can help us to visualize, conceptualize other possible futures that sit outside of the one that often feels too imminent or that we can't escape. And as speculative architect Liam Young puts it, when we write stories, we also write the world. Storytelling can be, as such, considered a critical act of design, transporting us to worlds beyond our own, get us excited for new alternatives, and act as an antidote to chaos. We tell stories for different reasons, but they can help to comfort us, they can educate us, they can even empower us, or add mystery, or even strip it away when needed. So now I would like to invite you to consider our 4 scenarios on urban living. Sorry. Where we have explored different aspects of urban living, but what these 4 scenarios have in common is that they started from an aspect of wanting to explore what city life would be like. Would it take on shape of more individualized or more towards communities and being together? The other part was, how are our cities organized, constructed, planned for? Looking at urban development, will we see a more organized type of way when we plan our city, more designed, more engineered, or do we have a sort of a more organic urban planning, urban development in the future, where the buildings and the urban sphere is sort of allowed to grow more organic. So in our first scenario, homegrown urbanism, we have a scenario where private actors have become the main actors within the city limits. And while neighborhoods flourish, invisible lines of exclusion have also formed. The organic growth and individualization have created complexities and sort of contrasting form of urban living, meaning that while some neighborhoods might flourish, others might fall behind. Where these areas that sort of thrive, they attract resources, talent, and innovation, and the other ones, they struggle to keep up with the new forces and playing field shaping and designing the city. And sort of where the divide also between the citizens, they're created a divide between the privilege and the disadvantage that has widened, highlighting the challenges of meeting individual needs while striving for inclusivity, equity, and also providing essential services for all the citizens. So living in the city has sort of been defined by emphasis on personal choice, and also put a lot of effort and focus on sort of creation of the sort of unique personal existence where your needs is met and you can really tailor your own life. And sort of looking through the lens of the human experience, we have this sort of physical development where the organic model allows the city to grow naturally. It's self-generating, and we have this situation where the urban sprawl becomes never ending. It just grows and grows. And therefore, due to the sort of divide in the city, there's also a need have arisen for shared housing, because it becomes more and more expensive to live in the more desirable neighborhoods within the city limits. So we have this contrasting narratives unfolding, celebration of continuous change and development, while at the same time creating this urban divide throughout the cities, this invisible lines of exclusion and inclusion. And we as humans, we experience this, that we have a lot of individual choices to be made in this city. We seek to harness this complexity and vibrancy within the city limit, and the city living has sort of become a beacon of hope for those who are thriving in communities. There's a lot of opportunity within the city, but fragmented social connection contribute to isolation. That since people are seeking the relationship that they want to have, maybe someone falls behind. Also, they have sort of the need to feel safe or staying safe due to the fact that some neighborhoods has sort of fallen behind. The need for security has also become a very important part of the city, but also in terms of climate change, when some parts of the city is falling behind, who takes on the responsibility to mitigate and adapt for the climate change? And the social part of this city is where our individuals are seeking connection and relationship that align with their preference, their values, their behavior. So they construct more self-selected communities or groups with like-minded people. But of course, this contributes to the added layer of exclusion. So these social networks are more based on shared values, interest, or ambition than maybe where you live or where you work. So diversity really takes the center stage in this scenario. In our next scenario, urban togetherness, we have a city that sort of operates on more of a bottom-up approach, where the citizen plays a crucial role in how the city is organized, providing solutions, services, and of course takes part in decision-making processes regarding urban development. And we have this sort of city that still sort of recognizes and affirms an ever-evolving dynamic of complexity, a city that's not maybe always efficient, but where sort of messiness and tribalism is allowed to coexist. And where the sort of residents have come to embrace this as a type of resilience, embrace the decentralized control where they have a lot more agency within the city limits, and where community-driven practices, while still prioritizing human connection and social cohesion to create an urban life of participation, coexistence on an individual, community, and even an urban level. Because belonging is integrated in city life. There's a feeling of being at home. So instead of sort of, as the previous scenario, having a more organized structure, here we have a messiness and a sort of organic development that sort of expands due to the needs currently in the city, where social and environmental resiliency is actually prioritized over profits. The need of the citizens and the city is what sort of guides the decision. And of course, there is some friction here as well. Maybe there is a lack of support in certain strategies. For example, in this case, infrastructure, like efficient transportation. There might be some resistance towards some types of change where the citizen might not feel included. And of course, the citizen recognize the need to adapt and build resilience. But it's also sort of when it becomes so locally focused or community organized, there might be a risk here that they are being insulated from the real world problems, that they might not be as important as what happened going on in the local neighborhood. And of course, here, the social aspect is the most important. So the feeling of being at home, being seen, being part of something bigger is fundamental to community life. Residents embrace resilience, the decentralized control, the community-driven practices. There's a lot of services and initiatives that is driven by the citizen is in this scenario, ranging from climate initiatives to more social community-driven initiatives building social connection. So human connection and social cohesion is really important here. And they sort of shifting the mindset from sort of a fast growing, we have a city that more grow modestly, where locally sourced economy has suppressed many types of job growth because everything is sort of happening on a more of a local level. So the growth is not as massive as you might have seen in other cities. So in our next scenario, no friction, no serendipity, we have a scenario where the city operates in a more monitored manner, where politics and top-down governance hold a fast grip on the city. With radical and systemic solutions become sort of imperative to bring around the changes set by extremely ambitious plans, whether it be climate adaptation, grand master plans, or infrastructural projects. So no one can really argue that life is good in the city. It's frictionless and every day unfolds without any delay or surprise. The needs of the citizens have become such an integrated part of the design for the city, yet within the measured, monitor, and maximized city, something has actually slowly disappeared. The sort of serendipity that sort of plays such a significant role in urban life has become an exception rather than a rule. And the citizens here, they live in this frictionless system where every individual has the opportunity to tailor their own life and living their own needs and well-being, but within the decided systems of the city. So here we have sort of a city that is really managed. It's more like a hub. It's measured, monitored. It's really down to the detail. So it's really driven by more larger scale developments and commercial interest. And sort of it becomes very convenient to live in the city. And while citizens are sort of really important for the design, it always has to be included in the system. So there's also this sort of feeling of an eco-sabotage and the city as a villain in the fight against climate change here, even though due to the fact that some plans might take priority over others. So here, every individual gets to tailor their own life to their own needs and well-being. And while the city at the same time is very frictionless, the city is at the same time collecting data and on the citizen movement to make life easier. But surveillance is also creating this type of a big brother feeling in the city, that there's always someone watching you. And of course, this can sort of a reduced social cohesion, is isolation that could happen here. And while it's really, really great to be in this system, of course, there is this sort of fear of just becoming a numbers in a greater urban system rather than being a human being. A system where every person is an island, where you have the ability to really shape and tailor your life to your individual needs, but where maybe the sort of human connection is a little bit failing due to the fact that the city really sort of makes the sort of hyper-connected digital life a lot easier due to the high technological development within the city, meaning that creating really deep social connection might be a little bit harder here. In the balancing act, we are now entering a city where environmental and climate concerns have really prompted action to secure the city's futures. And here the city really lies in primarily to develop a cohesive and efficient city based on predetermined guidelines and standards, where the planning process are centralized within the city administration. So this has created sort of a mixed-use neighborhood with focus on human scale developments and sustainability. And such initiative really symbolizes the city's desire to form vibrant communities where people can live, work, and play with a close proximity, fostering this really sense of local communities, but where really a lot part of life here is surrounded by human connection, creating these groups, tribes, if you like, of values, where ideas and interests, where everyone is expected to contribute what they can in any way or form. But yet there's friction in this scenario as well. So there might be some citizens that are beginning to take action to ensure a balance of the sort of top-down decision-making, community participation, and the individual freedom that they would like. So there's also this kind of notion of a rebellion going on when the citizens is sort of rebelling against the guides, the standards that the city administration is putting on top of this city. So here we have a city that is really focusing on providing resources and services to all of its citizens, create an equitable city, a city that is equal. And of course, it focuses on restorations and adding to existing strategies and solutions within, of course, the principle that has been laid on as plans for the city. And here, environmental and climate, of course, is a very big player, where it has sort of many of the initiatives that's been rolled out in the city has been due to environmental and climate concerns. And here sort of the standardized systems imposed on communities create policies that are not always in line with local demands and desires, because since everything has to be equal, it might not fit everyone or every neighborhood. So there's not much individual control over what happens in the city. So there's and there's also this tension between new and old cultural tradition that might be colliding here as the cities grow, where some areas where people really value the old cultural traditions might need to sort of fit into the new guidelines. So there's this also discussion on what type of architecture would this kind of city create when it's so set by standards and guidelines? Would everything just look the same, or, and in that sense, are we losing some of the sort of cultural traditions within the city that are visible in how the expression of the city is built? And of course, here it's a very human-centered approach toward designing the policies and infrastructure. And of course, there's a big element here where citizens are meant to support each other, not just as neighbors, but also within personal development and well-being. To have that kind of city net is really important in the city, that the citizens are there for each other. But again, there is this part of different types of living. So we're seeing maybe an intergenerational housing coming, people living together, everything to emphasize this type of supporting system between the citizens. So there's this level of safety and trust in communities that you can rely on your neighbors, your chosen community to be there for you. But again, there is this rebellion looming among citizens unwilling to live within the set boundaries of cities' plans, creating that friction. Is there something that is about to explode within the city, so we're seeing a bit of an unrest, or is it just a small kind of movement that might, change a few things? And with that, we have our 4 different scenarios. And these scenarios, they are, as I said before, they are not predictions. We hope that they will provoke you or inspire you, or maybe they bring out something that you haven't thought of before. But what we would like you to do is, instead of thinking maybe, will this happen or not in the beginning, think of what emotions that this evoke. What would it feel like to be in this world? What type of implication would one of these scenarios have on your organizations or the people, the places, the processes that you are involved in? And what implications that it has on individuals, groups, and communities that you interact with. So really a sense of sort of foundation for a discussion on what type of urban living would we like to have in the future. And might it look different from different parts of the world? I don't know. It probably will. But with that, I would like to say thank you for listening in. And yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Some great questions coming in.
Okay,
But I just
fantastic.
wanted to ask you something, Lovisa. When I've looked at some scenarios in the past, there's often kind of a dichotomy between dystopian and utopian, and there doesn't seem to be absolute extremes in this. Tell us a little bit about the thoughts behind that.
I think that when we wrote these scenarios, I think an importance for us was that we shouldn't be afraid of friction, like, because that's something that you meet every day. But the world isn't just good or bad, it's always a little bit of both. So that's something that we tried to sort of capture in these scenarios as well, that they might have a little bit of bad, a little bit of good, to create that kind of sense of familiarity of how life actually is now. And also I think that there is like the idea of a dystopian utopia, like one person's utopia can be another person's dystopia. So it's not really, always that easy to determine what is what, but we felt that it was really important to keep the scenarios grounded so they felt more real than venturing out in some kind of science fiction novel.
Great. Thank you. And I just wanted to highlight a comment from Sharon, who said she's feeling very drawn to the many values in the urban togetherness, i.e. not being profit focused, and the messiness. And Claire says, I have to agree with Sharon. It's the strongest for me, and for the emphasis on local level and community, though there are pros and cons to all scenarios. And I just wanted to say, you highlight exactly the reason that this is a workshop rather than a definitive scenario, a definitive solution there as well. in a workshop, would you discuss what people would prefer? Is that the idea? Because you talked about emotions and that kind of thing.
I think that, I mean, because we always have opinions, right? But I think also it is important to maybe not always think of the what we would like, but also actually consider what could happen. Because there might be something in a scenario that you don't like or you don't want to happen, but then what can you do to make sure that that doesn't happen? There's also a conversation of where we want to go and where we not want to go. And I think that if you always only think of what you prefer, you might miss something. And I think also we have had a lot of conversation around biases, like the assumptions that we already have, and if we get too focused on something that might just reinforce what we already believe in, meaning that we might miss something else. So I think it's really important to, I think it's great to talk about where we want to go, but I think the scenarios that you might not want can be equally as valuable to look at.
Yeah, and those biases were, we kind of tried to address those because, in fact, we did even name cities at one point, and we know that once you name a city, it becomes a bias. But that does lead me to the question from Michael. No, not Michael at all. From Mike Kelly. Are there examples of present cities that reflect each of the scenarios? And also, are some of the cities performing best regarding economics, environment, and social?
I mean, so like you said, each scenario started out to be placed in an actual city. So some like the scenarios is a little bit based on Austin, New Mexico, London, and Kuala Lumpur. But as you said, we experienced that actually limited people in sort of envisioning it for maybe the city that they were living in, because they become so like, this is not London, or this is, this could never happen here because, I mean, you have placed the scenario elsewhere. So, but I think it was really important for us to bring a little bit of everywhere into the scenario, so it's not sort of heavily Western focused, or because that is a way to sort of deal with biases, that you sort of maybe place yourself somewhere else or from a different perspective, even to sort of see, okay, but if I don't see the world as me, or I see it from the perspective of something else, will I then experience it differently? To sort of acknowledge that we have this sort of predetermined views of what the future or cities look like. And in terms of, I think each of it was economic, environmental, and social. I think each scenario addresses those topics in different ways. Some cities are more focused on climate. That has also maybe been a little bit from where we placed it in the beginning, that there are regions that are more, even now, challenged by climate change. Some cities were maybe a bit more driven by the economics parts due to the uncertainties we decided to work with. But I think each scenario has a little bit of both, of all the three of them in them. Some might be more present than others.
Great. Thank you. A long question here from Michael. The evolution of urban landscapes, particularly in America, have occurred during rapid growth of highways and automobile adoption, resulting in large geographic metropolitan areas. The city has been or part of or larger regional labour force. Reliance on highways and automobiles has diminishing returns and environmental consequences in the 21st century. Are there any activities to develop a new level of infrastructure, given numerous considerations of security, resilience, privacy, equitable access, etc.?
That was a really long question.
It was a long question. It is in the chat if you wanted to have a look at it in more detail, but you have to scroll up for it.
But I mean, if we're looking at infrastructure, infrastructure looks different from where you are in the world. I mean, just being in Copenhagen, we have a very different mobility infrastructure than, for example, a city in the US, meaning that the future of mobility might look very different from what city you are looking at, also due to the size of the city. I mean, in the beginning, we spoke about, how urbanization is still going on as a mega trend, and more cities will move into, more and more citizens or people will move into cities. And for example, Lagos, that by the end of this century will have projection like 90 million people living in one city. Like, what will that mean for mobility, infrastructure, services? That is something that we can't even imagine in Copenhagen, because that will never happen here. So I think I think thinking of where we are, because we have this, well, no, I can't remember who said it, but that the future is already here, is just not even distributed, meaning that it doesn't mean just because something happened in one place, it can happen where you are, but it doesn't necessarily mean so, but there's an indication. And when it comes to mobility, I think there's a lot of, I mean, for example, with cars, there's a lot of culture and value behind having a car that might mean that it's really difficult to change that mode of transportation, because there is a really sort of distinct structure in society that sort of speaks about you need to have a car, even if there's a lot of different mobilities options out there, but culturally you need to have a car, and cultural change is really, really slow and sometimes difficult to sort of imagine what that could be like, in terms of technology, where we are actually pretty good at sort of predicting what that would be like in the next coming years.
Yeah. And we're seeing in parts of London where there are potentially attempts at creating low traffic neighbourhoods designed for cycling and pedestrians, that there are lots of protests against it, as well as people supporting it. So, but that idea of cities being different brings me on to Michael's question. Are you suggesting that cities might evolve differently based on needs and preferences of local residents, or that global or large regional social, political and economic forces might drive one dominant scenario?
That's a very difficult question. Um, I think that looking at how urban planning works today, because I think that there is somewhat a continuation of designing building for needs that was defined in the past. I don't think there's a lot that has happened within urban planning over the last few decades. But I think that there is a need to discuss different approaches to urban planning, also due to the fact that the world is becoming more and more complex, the future even more. But if what will drive that change, I think it's really difficult to say. I know there's a lot of cities that has more ambitious climate goals than that the nation has. So there is a little bit of a divide between cities and nation. Will actually cities take on a more prominent role when it, for example, comes to climate adaptation and mitigation? Or will that come from a sort of a national, regional standpoint? I think that's really interesting, and I think it could go both ways.
Yeah, and I think when we did the workshops, it wasn't that these are four scenarios that every city will fit into one of these four scenarios. I think that it was just the idea to let's create discussion about the way that cities might go, and also then what is the implication for work and place and living and and healing and learning, and that kind of thing. And I think one of the things that I always say with scenarios, it's all of these and none of these kind of things. It's that's the nature.
And I think it's more also okay, so this happened in scenario B. Could that happen where I live? And if it's different, how is it different? Because that is also a really interesting conversation. It's because these are all, their imaginations of what the future could look like. But there are hundreds, thousands more of these versions like that could happen. It could be small tweaks within all of these scenarios, and you have four different ones. So I think I think it's good if you feel like, oh, this could never happen, because then you might be a little bit provoked or interested, and then you start thinking about what the future in your city would look like, and then you might pick something from two or three scenarios, like this could happen here. So I think bits and pieces can fit everywhere, but you can also challenge the scenarios and say, okay, if this, I don't believe that this could happen, but then what would happen? Would something be different? And what would that be like?
And that's the nature of why we're offering these as workshops, where you kind of work through, you could discuss it, you could challenge it. And I think right at the beginning, Lovisa said these are not predictions, but they're certainly provocations. So, great question from Clark here. In our current post-pandemic world, there appears to be huge levels of isolation and loneliness. Is this influencing current best practices for urban futures?
I think loneliness, but also I mean I'm originally from Sweden, and Sweden is one of the countries in the world that has most single person household where people live just one person, and that is something that probably will rise in other countries as well. So I think it's really interested to look at social connections, because something happened during COVID with how we work, how we live, how we interact with people. I mean, we're sitting here now online having having this conversation. um, so I think that of course it's really important, but I also think that there's an aspect of culture, because different parts of the world has different types of cultures, meaning that maybe some form of the more sort of community aspects that is very strong. For example, in Sweden, where we actually might lack that sense of community and are not that great at shaping those, that might be really naturally in another part of the world. So it's also um, a bit of a sort of geographical aspect of how we interact with each other and how we live together. But I think that it's super relevant to talk about, especially when it comes to actually the living, the working, the healing and the learning. Where will that take place, and how could that be different, and what would stay the same?
Great, thank you. A person called Ryan Anderson has asked a question. Lovisa, we talked about this on our About Place podcast, but how do you think the role of the residents and the architect and design community connecting, shaping how a city evolves, sorry.
um I mean, architects and designers might not always, especially when, okay, let's talk about building cities. The housing and building industry is really connected to profit. So it's like when I worked as an architect, you really didn't have a lot of contact to maybe potential future users. You had more contact with the developer who were like commissioning you to design a building, meaning that you might not even design for the people who will use it in the end, because it's more the conversation is more around how can we make most profit out of building this building. So I think it's not architects and citizens, it's the whole building industry that needs to come into this conversation, because I mean, architects in a lot of cases is not involved in designing a building. It's only a few percent of all the buildings built in the world that actually has an architect connected to the project. So it's an entire industry that really needs to come into this conversation and discuss what are we, who, what, and why are we designing our cities the way we are, and are we being brave enough to consider that? Are we being, do we have a long-term perspective? Because that's the thing with cities, it's here for a really, really long time. So are we not only considering the use of the citizens that live today, but future citizens? How will they use the city? We're talking a lot about new ways of working, living. If that is set to change, then maybe the way we design cities for now is completely wrong. And I had a conversation with an architect here in Copenhagen, and he said that we are building the same type of apartments like a very big standardized kitchen, and then we have 3 bedrooms for the kind of nuclear family. But Denmark's statistics looks at 37 different family constellations when they look at how we live together. So why are we only building for one type of family when already now we know it's really different from what it used to be?
Yeah, and I think that's again reflected in some of the observations about profit first, and that if that's a thing, that's where it needs to engage investors, developments, cities, countries, even in that brig before you get down to designing what the building looks like. An interesting question, and I have thought about this. I think we've discussed this. What about the NEOM building in Saudi Arabia? Have you seen that? The kind of miles long. How does
Yeah.
that fit into these scenarios?
I mean, I don't have that, like, I know what the project is. I've seen the renders. But to what detail um of the project, I'm not that knowledgeable. I think it's interesting. I mean, Neom, the line is not the only city right now being planned or explored that's sort of being built from scratch. It's also the Woven city outside of Tokyo, planned by Big and Toyota. So there is this kind of movement of building cities from scratch. Um, do I think that that works? I have no idea. I mean, I think it's interesting because humans are complex, and that's building that city will take a really, really long time. So will it fit the future world that it might be when it's done? I don't know.
And I think that you highlight the point that probably the most unpredictable part of any project is people, and that's always fun. I think, in fact, that whilst you're talking about starting building cities from scratch, I thought this is an interesting one from Suzanne. Can cities evolve and shift from one scenario to another depending on leadership, the population, the economic cycle? You know, if they fit under one scenario, but they will prefer, you know, can they move? Can they change?
I mean, I think so. It's like now we've explored, how the city is organized, how urban development is functioning, like between the organic and the extremely designed and engineer, meaning that or governance, bodies of governance and city administration plays different roles, right? So if that were to shift, then of course the way a city is planned and organized can change. But also I think that in some sense it also might be difficult because some of the projects has really, really long timelines. So if that's affected by, a political shift or something like that, I think it depends on where you are in the world. But I think that we've seen that human behavior shifts, political opinion shifts. So I think, of course, it could. I mean, there's not much that needs to happen for us to, for example, interact different with each other. So yeah, I also think that a city might develop with bits and pieces from different scenarios. So it's not a one-to-one development.
Yeah, and in fact, that was a question that was asked. What Alexandros mentioned, what about mixed scenarios for mega cities? That in fact you almost have cities within cities sometimes because they're so large, and you might see, could you see more than one scenario in a city kind of thing?
Oh, I mean, when we started, we looked at bigger cities, but I mean, let's imagine Lagos as an example, which is like might be a huge, huge city in the future. I I think that's completely possible that there's cities within cities. Um, I mean, it's neighborhoods within a city, so why couldn't it be somewhat cities within cities as well?
Yeah, yeah, I've really love this. Actually, I'm going to leave you with probably the one that for me is the firecracker. Do you think we should have long-term city governance structures that are not subject to the whims of the political government of the day?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, because cities are around for a really, really long time, and so why aren't we considering the people who might live there in the future as well? So, I mean, for example, we are better equipped to adapt to climate change or the needs of citizens, because I mean, I think we talked about it in the beginning of the project, all the empty offices building in London after COVID. Should we have buildings that can adapt to change in use? And I mean, there's something like mixed use buildings is not something new, but should that be more implemented in urban planning, for example? And then we really need to have that sort of long-term perspective when we plan and we build our cities.
Great. Thank you very much. I have really enjoyed this session. I'm wary of the time. I always try to give people 5 minutes before the next session. There are loads more questions. If you want to contact Lovisa, we will share email with you if that's okay with you, Lovisa. We will
Yeah, of course.
do that. We'll do that in the follow-up. You will get a copy of the deck. As you leave today, you will be taken to a website where you can give us some feedback. And if you're interested in a workshop in your region, either virtual or physical, do let us know. We'd love to hear more from you. Really enjoyed this. And I'm sorry I couldn't get to everyone's questions. That was superb. Lovisa, thank you. And your applause comes in the form of a few thank yous in a chat box now and a few emojis. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
everyone. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for some really interesting questions as well. So thank you for joining in.